questions regarding the place and nature of the human soul or mind have always been a part of Christian theology and Christian reflection. There isn't one answer that the Church has agreed on about the nature of the soul, and it's still debated today. And this means that there's space for considering from a Christian perspective how different views will fit, better or worse, with the gospel. This has led me to consider a theory called panpsychism. Panpsychism isn't really new. It's been around since the days of ancient Greek, Indian and Chinese philosophy, but it's undergone a revival of interest recently in Anglo-American philosophy. And I want to ask two questions, really. First, is panpsychism plausible enough that theologians and Christians should take it seriously as an option? And secondly, if it is plausible enough, and if it grows in popularity, then is it going to be beneficial to Christianity or harmful? Is it something the Church should embrace or perhaps be more careful about? But before I can answer those two questions, we first need to get clear on what panpsychism is. What does this term mean? Panpsychism is a theory, or perhaps a family of theories, because there are lots of different versions, but they all claim that consciousness is a fundamental and ubiquitous feature of the universe. So, first of all, let's look at the word. Pan is the Greek for everywhere or everything. Psyche means consciousness or mind in some sense. So we have a sense to which panpsychism is the idea that consciousness or psyche is everywhere or in everything. The more technical philosophical definition that I gave a moment ago, that consciousness is a fundamental and ubiquitous feature of the universe, is just a more precise way of spelling out this general idea. To say that something is fundamental is to say that it cannot be derived from anything else. So this places panpsychism in contrast to physicalism, which says that everything is physical and the mind can be derived from physical workings of the material world. And it also places panpsychism in contrast with emergentism, which says that although the mind cannot be fully explained or reduced to the physical, it can emerge out of the physical. Panpsychists say that the mind is fundamental, but so do substance dualists, in fact. Substance dualists will also say that consciousness cannot be derived from the physical. They think it's completely separate from the physical. Most substance dualists, therefore, have to tell a story whereby, say, God gives souls or minds to embryos at a certain point in their development or at the point of conception. They have to input consciousness into the world in some other way. Panpsychists, by contrast, say that the mind is not just fundamental, but it's also ubiquitous or everywhere. It's found within all matter, at least to some minimal degree. But why think that consciousness is found everywhere? Surely that's a bit bizarre. Well, panpsychists don't say everywhere in a straightforward, flat sense. It's clear to us all, really, that some things are conscious in a way that other things just aren't. Humans are clearly conscious. Animals are clearly conscious. But tables and chairs, definitely not. How does a panpsychist tackle this? Well, to a panpsychist, everything has consciousness within it in some very minimal way, because all matter has consciousness within it in some very minimal way. But that doesn't mean that every time you get a bunch of atoms together, they unify to create a singular mind. To panpsychists, a table just isn't arranged in the right way. It doesn't have enough complexity and unity in order to create a conscious table. But the little atoms that make up the table have that little piece of consciousness in it, just like everything else. By contrast, humans really are very complex and very unified. Our neural systems work in such a way that, again, we don't fully understand how, but clearly I'm a unified singular subject with consciousness. In a Christian narrative sense, my preferred way of stating the panpsychist's view of reality goes something like this. In the beginning, God created everything from nothing. God created everything in one instance by creating all the fundamental ingredients that were necessary for the world to develop as it has around us. The universe was never, therefore, just dead chunks of hollow stuff, but right from that first moment, it was always psychophysical, containing experience and some basic form of subjectivity, as well as physicality and mathematical structure. In this sense, God has created all souls and all consciousness ex nihilo, just as God created everything in creation. Over time, these psychophysical elements have cooled, duplicated, divided, combined, and unified, such that we have organisms and objects around us. As I said earlier, some of these structures have not unified to create new minds, and others have unified, such as in living things. So that's the basic idea of how the panpsychist sees the place of consciousness in creation. But what are the arguments for or against this view? For this, we can turn to the more recent revival of interest in panpsychism in Anglo-American speaking philosophy. In 1979, Thomas Nagel published a little essay about panpsychism, where he gave four premises of an argument that would conclude that panpsychism was true. Now, he said that each of these premises are almost certainly correct, but in 1979, he just couldn't believe that panpsychism was really a plausible solution. But let's look at what the premises were and how the argument worked. The first premise is what's called ontological materialism or monism. Monism is the idea that there's just one type of stuff in the universe. And ontological, that means being, the study of what exists, and materialism, that all these things are material. So this premise says that there's one type of stuff as we encounter it, and we call this stuff matter. That seems pretty plausible. In a sense, what this premise is doing is ruling out a strong substance dualism, the idea that there's two types of stuff. The second premise Nagel offered is mental realism. This is the idea that, quite intuitively, we are conscious things. Our minds are real. We're not just an illusion. I think that's a pretty obvious premise to be correct. The third premise is that you can't get mentality or consciousness out of dead matter. Nagel called this no psychophysical reduction. You can't explain consciousness by explaining how matter works, the mechanical operations or functions or mathematical structures of the physical world. Fascinating and complex though those are, and important for all sorts of explanations, nothing there will fully explain what it's like to be alive, to experience the world, to see redness or taste chocolate. The fourth premise is no emergence. This is closely related to the no reduction premise. The no emergence premise says that no matter how complicated and wonderful the structures of the physical world are, if they're just physical and there's nothing experiential going on, then you'll never get a conscious organism, a conscious mind emerging out of physical structure. If we accept these four premises, Nagel argued, then the logical conclusion is panpsychism. If you think that minds are real and you can't get them out of a non-mental material stuff, then you've got to put minds in at the bottom of reality. You've got to say that it was always there as an ingredient, and it has complexified along with our bodies, along with the material world, to form the conscious organisms we are and others we experience in the world around us. But as I said earlier, Nagel couldn't quite accept that conclusion back in the 1970s. But slowly other philosophers have thought about this argument, and they've lent their own ideas as to why we should take it seriously and accept the conclusion that follows. Another key thinker here is an Australian philosopher called David Chalmers. Through series of thought experiments and arguments, he really added to the third premise, the idea that psychophysical reduction just isn't going to explain consciousness. He also argued that panpsychism, or something close to panpsychism, is actually going to be a surprisingly scientific theory. It's going to abide by laws or principles, and that he thought panpsychism could be a genuine scientific research project. Wasn't sure as to where that would lead, but that in a sense added some credibility to the theory. The next figure to come along is a British philosopher called Galen Strawson. And Strawson's arguments really added to the fourth premise. That was the no emergence premise. Strawson argued, and this is a favourite quote I have of his, he said, "You can make chalk from cheese or water from wine, because if you go down to the subatomic level, they're both the same stuff. But you can't make experience from something wholly non-experiential." And I think that really captures the sense in which the panpsychist argument and this trajectory of thinking is really trying to say that while consciousness is real and there's only one type of stuff in the universe, we can't collapse consciousness into a mechanical or mathematical explanation. We then get a new argument developing, again from Thomas Nagel, this time in 2012. In 2012, he published a short book called Mind and Cosmos: Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False. And in a section of this book, he argues that panpsychism looks very likely when we remember that the whole universe and everything in it is made out of basically the same stuff that can be recycled and changed. And what this means is that whilst my cells are human cells with human DNA in them, fundamentally the atoms that make up those cells are no different from the atoms that make up the table or the chair that I'm sitting on. But the table and the chair that I'm sitting on, as we said earlier, clearly aren't conscious, and I am. And this idea that we're made out of the same stuff, but sometimes we're organised in such a way to create a living conscious organism, and sometimes that stuff is organised in such a way as to make just a table or a chair. This suggests that it's not the stuff that's different. There are not two substances in the world, there's just one. And what matters is how it's organised. Nagel concluded from this that all elements of the physical world should be thought of as both physical and mental. And that is the panpsychist idea. In many ways, Nagel is revising and updating a line of argument that goes back to the early 20th century with William James. William James said, if evolution is to work smoothly, consciousness in some shape must have been present at the very origin of things. Evolution is a smooth progress of very slow change. It doesn't take massive leaps, certainly not of massive metaphysical natures, such as the leap that would be necessary to get from a non-conscious thing to a conscious thing. And if you accept this smooth change of evolution throughout the natural world, then you need at least the ingredients for consciousness, at least a minimum form of consciousness to slowly work its way down the great chain of being. So these are, broadly speaking, the arguments for panpsychism. The idea of a smooth evolutionary story, the idea that we're made out of the same stuff, The idea that consciousness is so different in quality and kind from the mechanical, physical workings of nature that it can't be explained in the same mechanical way. But what are the objections? What are the arguments against panpsychism? Well, the first objection that most panpsychists face is what I call the incredulous stare. What? Surely it's just too weird. You're saying that atoms are in some sense conscious. When we think about that, that is a pretty weird thing to say, at least for most 21st century Westerners. But the thing with the incredulous stare is, it's based on our prior assumptions. It turns out that many people throughout history and around the world have thought something close to panpsychism. Sometimes it's been called animism or other closely related labels. It's been popular in various ways across indigenous cultures, across Asian philosophies, and even in Western philosophy if you look in a longer historical arc. So the incredulous stare in and of itself isn't a very good objection, because it just kind of says, well, that doesn't fit with the way I already see the world. But that's not an argument, at least not yet. Another type of objection is often phrased as a question. Where's the evidence? Now, the search for evidence is a noble quest in any sort of theorizing and search for truth. But we've always got to ask ourselves, what kind of evidence would prove or disprove a certain theory? And it turns out that all philosophical theories of consciousness are empirically equivalent. That is, they all take on board the best scientific evidence of the day and make sense of it according to their own logic and within their own worldview or theory. Panpsychism, as I said, gets support from evolution and the idea that it's smooth. Some quantum physicists are also interested in panpsychism, but I wouldn't say that quantum physics or biological evolution proves panpsychism in a strong sense. I also wouldn't say that these scientific areas prove physicalism or substance dualism or emergentism. These are all equivalent from the perspective of science. This is a philosophical dispute, and so it's philosophy we need rather than scientific evidence to help us decide which is most likely to be the correct theory. Finally, the major objection to panpsychism, the one that I think is the biggest problem for panpsychists, is called the combination problem. Again, this can be phrased as a question. It might go like this. So the panpsychist says that all the little atoms or electrons or perhaps fields across space-time are conscious. Whatever the most physically fundamental things are, the panpsychist says those are conscious. Okay, I'll accept that for a moment. That still doesn't tell me how we get from that type of consciousness to the type of consciousness that humans enjoy. I tried to tell a story of combination and unification earlier, but it was still a little imprecise. How do we really combine little bits of consciousness or subjects to form a fully complex human being with emotions and rationality and complex desires and questions about the nature of the universe? Atoms don't think or feel or question the nature of reality. So how do we get from them to us? Again, I think this is best thought of not as an objection, but as a demand for further theorizing, a demand for a more compelling version of the panpsychist story. And I think it's a fair demand. Panpsychists react to this question in different ways. Some say, okay, I'm going to try and give you a better story. They try and think up ideas for how it could be that subjects combine and under what conditions. Other panpsychists think, oh, that's a really hard question, and I just don't think that subjects could combine, and so they try and avoid the question altogether. For example, some panpsychists think that until you get to the level of a complex human or animal, there aren't full subjects in the universe. There are just free-floating experiences or qualities, something that's not quite a full subject, but is still mental. Other panpsychists say that combining subjects is difficult, but maybe we could divide them. And so they suggest that rather than thinking of every atom as a conscious mind, we should think of the universe as a whole, as one big consciousness, and we're divided into little parts of that consciousness. That's called cosmopsychism. Again, another solution is to try and use a version of emergence that's seen as compatible with panpsychism. So whereas traditional emergence sees a purely physical world to start with, and then conscious subjects miraculously appear or emerge out of that physical world, a panpsychist emergence would see the world as already in some sense mental and experiential, but more complex subjects still need this emergent story to say how we get from, as it were, them, the little minds, to us, the big minds. Now we've looked at the arguments for and against panpsychism, I think we're ready to answer that first question. Is panpsychism plausible enough to at least be taken seriously by the Church and by Christians more widely? I think the answer is yes. I'm not 100% sure it's the true and correct view, but I think it's at least as good as all the other arguments and possible views on the table. It's something that the Church should take seriously. So what about the second question? If panpsychism is worth taking seriously, or if it becomes a more and more popular theory in our society, how should we respond as Christians? Is the theory of panpsychism beneficial to Christianity, or are there some things we should be worried about? The first thing to say here is that panpsychism is very flexible from a religious or theological standpoint. Panpsychism has been included within all sorts of religious views. For example, panpsychism has been a part of various kinds of pantheism, which suggests that God and the world are identical, or polytheism, the idea that there's lots of gods, or paganism. These are theological ideas that are incompatible with Christianity. And so if panpsychism and pantheism automatically go together, that should be a big worry for the Church. But I don't think that's the right conclusion to draw. Pantheism and panpsychism only go together if you think that God is the same thing as consciousness. But I don't think we should say that. After all, I'm conscious, but I'm definitely not God. Same for your pets. They're probably conscious, but I don't think most people think of their pets as divine. So panpsychism is just a view about the mind. It's not, strictly speaking, a view about God, but I think it has lots of benefits for Christianity. My preferred way of explaining this is to think of God and creation in a call and response kind of relationship. So God calls to creation. I think panpsychism helps us make sense of this because it helps us understand how God could be present within the world, within all parts of the world, within every inch, by being present in the minds that God has created in creation. Remember, mind and matter go together in panpsychism. Minds are within all of matter. So this isn't a way of saying that matter is bad or God is incompatible with the material. It's a way of trying to make sense of how God can be within the material world, close to it, to every inch and to its very depths. What about the response part? Well, as God moves in and is present within the material world, I think panpsychism helps us make sense of how the world responds to God. We might think of those passages in the prophetic texts of the Old Testament, as well as in a few places in the New Testament, where creation is depicted as praising God, where stones will cry out, where trees will wave their hands. Now, stones don't have voice boxes, and trees don't have hands. But still, I think we can make sense of these passages in a realist, while still poetic way, when we embrace something like panpsychism, because then we are really able to say that even in some basic way, these things contain subjectivity. They are subjects that can praise God in a way suitable to the consciousness that they have. They are not just passive or dead, without any ability to respond to their creator. A panpsychist universe is therefore an enchanted universe, a universe of praise, in which humans are members of a common congregation of creation. We might have a special role in this congregation, to be its worship leaders or to direct the prayers of creation to God, but we are not so radically different. We are definitely creatures and not little gods in this creation. Panpsychism is a theory that has been found throughout world history. It is also a theory that we can see in the tradition of the Church. Christian thinkers like Gregory of Nyssa, Maximus the Confessor, Gottfried von Leibniz, as well as Francis of Assisi, and more recently Jürgen Moltmann and Sally McFay, have all embraced panpsychism or something very close to it, because they think it allows them to explain God's presence in the world, as well as the world's response to God in ways that are beneficial to the Church. I think that's really exciting. And so if the recent revival of interest from philosophers in panpsychism is to continue, if this idea is to grow and develop with new scientific interest, philosophical interest, and other kinds of interest, perhaps from post-colonial theorists as well, this is something the Church can collaborate with, get on board with, and share its own insights for. I hope you feel like you understand panpsychism a little better having watched this video, and are even excited by the possibility that all creation could really be praising God with us.